On a bitter winter night in the Wyoming Territory, a struggling young cowboy finds an old man wandering lost and confused in the freezing wilderness. With barely enough to feed himself, he makes a choice that defies all logic, bringing the stranger home, offering warmth, food, and shelter, despite having almost nothing. What he doesn't know is that this one act of kindness will unlock a door to a future he never imagined possible. The old man's son will arrive with an offer that changes everything, proving that sometimes the smallest gesture of compassion can reshape an entire destiny. Margaret busied herself with cleaning the dishes, her movements slow and deliberate, while Lucy had curled up on the small cot in the corner, fighting sleep but losing the battle. Caleb sat on the floor near the stove, his back against the rough wooden wall, watching Samuel with a mixture of relief and concern. The old man was safe for now, but tomorrow would bring new questions. Where did he come from? Who was looking for him? And what was Caleb supposed to do if no one came? His gaze drifted to Samuel's hands, still trembling slightly even in the warmth. That's when he noticed it, a glint of metal catching the flickering candlelight, a bracelet thin and silver, wrapped around Samuel's wrist. It looked expensive, well-crafted, the kind of thing a man of means would wear. Caleb leaned forward slightly, squinting in the dim light. There was something etched into the metal, small letters or numbers he couldn't quite make out from where he sat. "Sir," Caleb said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Samuel." The old man's eyes opened slowly, focusing on Caleb with that same distant, foggy expression. "That bracelet," Caleb continued gently. "May I take a look at it?" Samuel blinked, glancing down at his wrist as if noticing the bracelet for the first time. He nodded weakly, extending his arm toward Caleb. Caleb moved closer, kneeling beside the chair, and carefully took Samuel's wrist in his hands. The bracelet was heavier than it looked, solid silver with intricate engravings along its surface. But it was the inside that caught Caleb's attention, a series of numbers, small but clear, etched into the underside of the band. A telegraph code. Caleb's heart quickened. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a way to contact someone who likely knew exactly who Samuel was and where he belonged. "Ma," Caleb called softly, glancing over his shoulder. "I think I found something." Margaret set down the dish she'd been drying and came over, her brow furrowed. Caleb pointed to the numbers, and her eyes widened slightly. "That's a telegraph station code," she said quietly. "Someone wanted to make sure he could be found if he got lost." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. "I need to get to the telegraph office. Someone might be looking for him." Margaret hesitated, glancing at the darkened window. "It's late, Caleb, and the office might be closed." "Then I'll wake them up," Caleb said firmly, already rising to his feet. "If someone's been searching for him all day, they need to know he's safe." Margaret studied her son for a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful." Caleb grabbed his coat and hat, gave Samuel one last reassuring look, and slipped out into the cold night. The telegraph office was a small building near the center of town, its windows dark save for a single lamp burning in the back room. Caleb pounded on the door, his breath coming out in white clouds, until finally a gruff voice called from inside. "We're closed. Come back tomorrow." "It's an emergency," Caleb shouted back. "I need to send a message. Now." There was a pause, then the sound of heavy footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing the telegraph operator, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an irritated expression. "This better be important, boy." "It is," Caleb said quickly, stepping inside. "I found a man lost in the snow. He has a telegraph code on his bracelet. I need to contact whoever it belongs to." The operator's irritation faded slightly, replaced by curiosity. "Let me see the code." Caleb recited the numbers from memory, and the operator moved to his desk, flipping through a worn ledger. His finger traced down a list of codes, then stopped abruptly. His eyes widened. Thornhill Ranch, he said, his voice suddenly serious. That's William Thornhill's private line. Caleb's stomach dropped. William Thornhill. Everyone in the territory knew that name. The wealthiest rancher for hundreds of miles, owner of the largest spread of land anyone had ever seen. Send the message, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the sudden weight pressing on his chest. Tell him his father is safe. On a bitter winter night in the Wyoming Territory, a struggling young cowboy finds an old man wandering lost and confused in the freezing wilderness. With barely enough to feed himself, he makes a choice that defies all logic, bringing the stranger home, offering warmth, food, and shelter, despite having almost nothing. What he doesn't know is that this one act of kindness will unlock a door to a future he never imagined possible. The old man's son will arrive with an offer that changes everything, proving that sometimes the smallest gesture of compassion can reshape an entire destiny. The wind howled across the barren landscape of dust-born Wyoming Territory, cutting through Caleb Morgan's worn coat like 1,000 frozen knives. He pulled his hat lower, his breath visible in thick clouds as he trudged through the snow-dusted main street. His boots, cracked and splitting at the seams, crunched against the frozen ground with each labored step. The town around him was a patchwork of weathered wooden buildings, their paint long stripped away by relentless winds and harsh winters. Lanterns flickered weakly in a few windows, casting pale yellow light onto the empty streets. Caleb was 19 years old, but the lines etched into his face made him look older. His shoulders carried a weight no young man should bear, the weight of responsibility, of hunger, of watching his mother work herself to the bone, while his little sister asked questions he couldn't answer. Questions like, will we eat tomorrow? Or, why can't we buy new shoes? He adjusted the burlap sack slung over his shoulder, feeling its pitiful lightness. Inside were a few pieces of scrap metal he'd collected from the edge of town, maybe worth $1 at the trading post if he was lucky. It wasn't much, but it might buy a loaf of bread or a small bag of flour. Every cent mattered when you were barely surviving. As he passed the front of the Silver Spur Saloon, warm light spilled onto the street, along with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Through the frosted window, Caleb could see the sons of wealthy ranchers and mine owners gathered around a table, their faces flushed from expensive whiskey, their clothes fine and tailored. They looked warm, comfortable, untouched by the brutal reality that defined his life. One of them glanced up and spotted him through the window. Garrett Hawthorne, the son of the territory's largest mine owner, nudged his companions and pointed. The group turned to stare, smirks spreading across their faces. Caleb kept his head down and quickened his pace, but Garrett wasn't content to let him pass in peace. The saloon doors swung open, and the group spilled out onto the wooden boardwalk, their boots thudding heavily against the planks. Well, if it isn't Caleb Morgan," Garrett drawled, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Out scavenging again? Find anything valuable today, or just more trash?" Laughter erupted from the group. Another boy, shorter but equally well-dressed, chimed in. "Maybe if he polishes those scraps real nice, someone might throw him a few coins." "Doubt it," Garrett said, his grin widening. "Nobody pays good money for garbage." Caleb's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists inside his coat pockets. He wanted to turn around, to tell them exactly what he thought of their cruelty, to make them understand what it felt like to go to bed hungry, to watch your mother's hands bleed from endless work, to hear your little sister cry because she was cold and there was no wood left for the fire. But he didn't. He couldn't. His mother's words echoed in his mind, steady and firm. "You don't get to make mistakes the way they do, Caleb. A poor boy standing up for himself is always seen as trouble, no matter how right he is. Keep your head down, keep moving, and don't give them a reason." So he did. He kept walking, his shoulders hunched against the wind and their laughter, his boots crunching through the snow as he left them behind. The cold bit deeper now, or maybe it was just the shame that made it feel that way. He hated this town. Hated the way it divided people into those who mattered and those who didn't. Hated the way boys like Garrett could mock him without consequence, while he had to swallow his pride just to survive another day. But most of all, he hated that he couldn't do anything to change it, at least not yet. Caleb hadn't meant to take the long way home, but his feet carried him toward the edge of town anyway, past the last row of buildings and into the open expanse, where the land stretched wild and unforgiving. Red Canyon Pass loomed in the distance, its jagged cliffs barely visible through the swirling snow. The wind was fiercer here, unblocked by structures, cutting across the frozen plains like a whip. He should have turned back. The temperature was dropping fast, and darkness was settling over the territory like a heavy blanket. But something about the quiet out here, away from the town's judgment and cruelty, made him pause. Out here, he could breathe. Out here, he wasn't just the poor kid everyone looked down on. Then he saw him. At first, Caleb thought it was a trick of the fading light, a shadow maybe, or a fallen tree branch half buried in the snow. But as he stepped closer, the shape became clearer. An old man sat slumped against a large rock, his body trembling violently, his thin coat doing nothing to shield him from the biting cold. His hat had blown off, resting a few feet away in the snow, and his white hair was wild and unkempt, whipping in the wind. Caleb's breath caught. The man wasn't moving much, just sitting there staring blankly at the ground, his lips pale and his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Hey," Caleb called out, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching through the snow. "Sir, are you all right?" The old man didn't respond. His eyes, a faded gray, lifted slowly to meet Caleb's, but there was no recognition in them, only confusion, like he was looking at something far away that he couldn't quite understand. Caleb dropped to one knee beside him, his own body shivering from the cold. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" "It's freezing. You'll die if you stay out here much longer." The man's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely above a whisper, he murmured, I don't know where I am." Caleb's stomach twisted. He glanced around, but the landscape was empty. No wagon, no horse, no sign of anyone else. Just the two of them and the merciless wind. "Do you know your name?" Caleb asked gently, trying to keep his voice calm despite the urgency rising in his chest. The man blinked slowly, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to remember something important. "Samuel," he said finally, his voice cracking. I think my name is Samuel." "Okay, Samuel," Caleb said, exhaling a shaky breath. "Do you know how you got out here? Were you with someone?" Samuel's gaze drifted again, unfocused. I was with someone. My son, I think. But I can't." His voice trailed off, his hands trembling harder now. "I can't remember." Caleb's mind raced. This man needed help, real help. He should find the deputy, or someone from town who might know who Samuel was. But the town was at least a mile back, and by the time Caleb returned with help, this man could be dead. He looked at Samuel again, taking in the expensive leather of his boots, now scuffed and caked with snow, the quality of his coat despite its thinness, the silver watch chain just visible beneath his lapel. This wasn't some drifter or vagrant. This was someone important, someone who belonged somewhere far better than this frozen wasteland. But right now, none of that mattered. Caleb's stomach growled, reminding him of the single piece of bread waiting for him at home. His mother and Lucy were waiting too, probably wondering where he was. They had so little already, and bringing home a stranger would mean stretching what they had even thinner. But then he thought about the way Samuel's hands shook, the way his lips were turning blue, the way his eyes looked so lost and afraid. Caleb's mother had always told him, "Be better than the world is to you." He sighed, his breath visible in the cold air, and made his decision. "All right, Samuel," he said, standing and reaching down to help the old man to his feet. "You're coming with me." Getting Samuel to his feet was harder than Caleb expected. The old man's legs wobbled beneath him, his body weak from the cold and confusion. Caleb wrapped one of Samuel's arms around his shoulders, steadying him as best he could, and began the slow, difficult journey back toward town. The wind fought them every step of the way, and more than once Samuel stumbled, nearly pulling them both down into the snow. But Caleb held firm, his jaw clenched with determination, his own exhaustion pushed aside by the desperate need to get this man somewhere warm. By the time they reached the edge of Dustbourne, Caleb's arms ached and his lungs burned from the cold air. He guided Samuel through the narrow streets, past the saloon where Garrett and his friends were likely still drinking, past the shuttered storefronts and darkened windows, until finally they arrived at a small, sagging structure at the far end of town. Home. It wasn't much, just a one-room cabin with walls that let in the cold and a roof that leaked when it rained. But it was theirs, and right now, it was the warmest place Caleb could offer. He pushed open the door, and immediately the faint warmth of the small wood stove greeted them. His mother, Margaret, looked up from where she sat, mending a torn shirt by candlelight. Her dark hair, streaked with gray despite her young age, was pulled back in a loose bun, and her hands, calloused and worn, paused mid-stitch. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of Caleb, supporting a shivering stranger. "Caleb," she said slowly, rising to her feet. "Who is this?" Caleb helped Samuel to the only chair they had, near the stove, before turning to face his mother. "I found him out by Red Canyon Pass. He was freezing, Ma. He doesn't remember how he got there or where he's supposed to be." Margaret's expression shifted between concern and something else. Worry, maybe, or the weight of knowing they could barely take care of themselves, let alone a stranger. She looked at Samuel, really looked at him, and her features softened. "He'll die if he stays out there," Caleb added quietly. Margaret was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving from Samuel's trembling form to her son's determined face. Then she sighed, a sound heavy with resignation, but also something warmer, compassion. "All right," she said softly, moving toward the stove. "Sit him down. I'll heat up what we have." Lucy, Caleb's 8-year-old sister, peeked out from behind the thin curtain that separated their sleeping area from the rest of the cabin, her wide brown eyes fixed on Samuel with curiosity, and she padded over on bare feet, clutching a small, threadbare blanket. "Is he sick?" she whispered to Caleb. "Just cold and confused," Caleb replied, kneeling to meet her eyes. "But he'll be okay." Lucy nodded seriously, then approached Samuel with the careful deliberation of a child who understood hardship. She draped the blanket over his shoulders, smoothing it gently with her small hands. "There," she said quietly. "That should help." Samuel's gaze, which had been distant and unfocused, suddenly sharpened as he looked down at the little girl. His lips trembled, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, recognition, or maybe just the overwhelming realization that someone cared. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret returned with a bowl of thin soup, mostly water with a few vegetables and a small piece of salted pork floating in it. She set it in front of Samuel, along with half a piece of bread. Then she placed another bowl in front of Caleb. Caleb looked down at his portion, then at the bread. Without hesitation, he tore off half and added it to Samuel's plate. "Caleb," his mother started, but he shook his head. "He needs it more than I do." Samuel lifted the spoon with trembling hands and took a slow sip. His eyes closed, and for a long moment he just sat there, as if the simple act of being warm and fed was something he'd forgotten could exist. When he opened his eyes again, they were glistening. "Thank you," he said again, his voice breaking. "Thank you." Caleb nodded, a tight knot forming in his chest. He didn't know who this man was or where he came from, but tonight he was family. The message was sent within minutes, the telegraph operator's fingers moving swiftly across the keys, tapping out the coded message that would travel through the wires to Thornhill Ranch. Caleb stood by the window, his arms crossed, watching the empty street outside as anxiety gnawed at his insides. What if William Thornhill didn't believe him? What if he thought this was some kind of trick? Or worse, what if he didn't care? "Message delivered," the operator said, breaking the silence. "If anyone's at the ranch station, they'll get it within the hour." Caleb nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." He stepped back out into the cold night, pulling his coat tighter as he made his way back to the cabin. The wind had died down slightly, but the temperature had dropped even further, turning his breath into thick clouds of vapor. His mind churned with questions, doubts, and a growing sense that everything was about to change. When he pushed open the cabin door, Samuel was asleep in the chair, his head tilted to one side, Lucy's blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. Margaret looked up from where she sat, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "Did you send it?" she asked quietly. "Yeah," Caleb replied, closing the door behind him. "Now we wait." They didn't have to wait long. Less than 2 hours later, the sound of hoofbeats thundered through the quiet streets of Dustbourne, rapid and urgent. Caleb was dozing against the wall when the sound jolted him awake. He scrambled to his feet and moved to the window, peering out through the frosted glass. A horse, a magnificent black stallion, came to a halt just outside the cabin, its breath steaming in the cold air. The rider dismounted in one swift motion, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a fine wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat that marked him as a man of wealth and authority. His face, even in the dim light, was etched with worry and exhaustion. William Thornhill. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest as he moved to the door, opening it before the man could knock. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. William's gaze was sharp, assessing, but beneath it was something raw, desperation barely held in check. "You're the one who sent the message?" William asked, his voice low and controlled, though it trembled slightly at the edges. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied, stepping aside. "He's inside. He's safe." William didn't waste another second. He stepped through the doorway, his eyes immediately finding Samuel asleep in the chair. His entire body seemed to sag with relief, his hand coming up to cover his mouth as he exhaled a shaky breath. "Oh, thank God," he whispered, his voice breaking. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and knelt beside his father, his hand gently resting on Samuel's shoulder. "Pa," he said softly. "Pa, it's me. It's William." Samuel's eyes fluttered open, confused at first, then slowly focusing on his son's face. Recognition dawned gradually, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "William," he murmured, his voice weak but filled with something that might have been relief. "Yeah, Pa. It's me. I've got you now." Margaret stood quietly in the corner, her arms wrapped around Lucy, who watched the scene with wide, curious eyes. Caleb remained near the door, feeling like an intruder in this intimate moment of reunion. William stayed there for a long moment, his hand gripping his father's, his head bowed as if in silent prayer. Then he stood, turning to face Caleb and his family. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw tight with emotion. "You saved his life," William said, his voice thick. "I've been searching since this afternoon. I thought—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "I thought I'd lost him." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would do." William's expression changed, something unreadable flickering across his face. "No," he said firmly, "not anyone. Most people would have left him out there, or turned him over to the sheriff and forgotten about him. But you brought him into your home. You fed him, kept him warm." His gaze swept over the small, threadbare cabin, taking in the cracked walls, the meager supplies, the single wood stove struggling to heat the space. "You gave him what little you had." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. William reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. He extended it toward Margaret. "Please, take this. It's the least I can do." Margaret stiffened, her chin lifting slightly. "We don't take charity, Mr. Thornhill." "It's not charity," William said gently. "It's gratitude." Margaret's hand hesitated in the air, her pride warring with the practical reality of their situation. Caleb could see it in her eyes, the same struggle he'd felt earlier when deciding whether to help Samuel. The weight of responsibility, the knowledge that refusing this money meant another week of hunger, another month of patching clothes that were already beyond repair. Slowly she reached out and took the pouch, her fingers closing around it carefully. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. William nodded, but his attention had already shifted back to Caleb. He studied the young man for a long moment, his sharp eyes taking in the worn boots, the threadbare coat, the calloused hands of someone who worked hard for every scrap he earned. "How old are you, son?" William asked. 19, sir," Caleb replied, straightening slightly under the scrutiny. "You work?" "When I can find it. Odd jobs, mostly. Hauling freight, mucking stables, whatever needs doing." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Work's hard to come by in Dustbourne if your last name isn't Hawthorne or Preston." William's expression darkened slightly at the mention of those names, as if he understood exactly what Caleb meant. "You know how to handle cattle? Horses?" Caleb blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Some." "I worked a roundup last spring for a week before the foreman ran out of money to pay us. And I've handled horses since I was old enough to walk." William was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant, as if calculating something in his mind. Then he looked at Margaret. "Ma'am, may I speak plainly?" Margaret nodded, her expression guarded. "Your son saved my father's life tonight," William said, his voice steady and sincere. "Samuel has dementia. His mind comes and goes. I took him into town for supplies, and I looked away for just a moment. When I turned back, he was gone. I've been riding in circles for hours, checking every street, every alley, terrified I'd find him frozen in a ditch somewhere." His voice caught, and he paused, composing himself before continuing. "But instead, your son found him. Not only found him, but brought him here, gave him warmth, food, and kindness, when you had almost nothing to spare. That kind of character," he shook his head, "that's rare. Rarer than gold." Caleb felt his face flush, uncomfortable with the praise. "I want to offer him a job," William said, turning back to Caleb, "at Thornhill Ranch. Room and board included, fair wages, better than anything you'll find in this town. I need good men, men I can trust, and I believe you're one of them." Caleb's breath caught. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was hearing. A job at Thornhill Ranch? That was the kind of opportunity men spent years working toward, the kind of position that could change everything. Caleb started, then stopped, glancing at his mother. "Ma, I can't just leave you and Lucy." William raised a hand. "I'm not asking you to abandon your family. The wages I'm offering would be enough to support them. And if they want to come with you, there's a small house on the property. Nothing fancy, but it's solid, warm, and it's yours if you want it." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Lucy, who had been silent until now, looked up at her mother with hope shining in her young face. "You'd do that?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "For us?" "Your son gave my father his dignity back tonight," William said simply. "He treated him like a human being when he was at his most vulnerable. That's worth more than money, Mrs. Morgan. It's worth everything." Caleb felt something crack open in his chest. Hope, maybe, or the possibility of a future that had always seemed impossibly out of reach. He looked at his mother, at Lucy, at the tiny cabin that had been their prison for so long. Then he looked at William Thornhill, standing tall and certain in the flickering candlelight, offering a hand up instead of a handout. "When do I start?" Caleb asked, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. William smiled. "Tomorrow morning. Pack what you need. I'll send a wagon for you at dawn." Dawn came cold and clear, the sky painted in shades of pale gold and soft pink as the sun crept over the horizon. Caleb stood outside the cabin, his few belongings packed into a worn canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead, the ranch, the work, the possibility of a life beyond survival. Margaret and Lucy stood beside him, bundled in their coats, watching the end of the street where the wagon would appear. Lucy clutched her mother's hand, her eyes bright with excitement and a touch of nervousness. Margaret's expression was harder to read. Relief, certainly, but also something deeper. Pride, perhaps, mixed with the bittersweet knowledge that everything was about to change. The sound of wheels crunching over frozen ground broke the morning silence. A sturdy wagon pulled by two strong horses rounded the corner, driven by a weathered ranch hand with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard. He tipped his hat as he brought the wagon to a stop. "Morning, folks," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Name's Charlie. Mr. Thornhill sent me to bring you out to the ranch." Caleb helped his mother and sister into the back of the wagon before climbing up himself. As they pulled away from the cabin, he looked back one last time at the place that had been both shelter and prison. Part of him would miss it, not the cold or the hunger, but the closeness it had forced upon them, the way hardship had bound them together. But another part of him, the part that had spent too many nights wondering if tomorrow would be better, felt nothing but relief. Thornhill Ranch stretched across the landscape like something out of a dream. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, sturdy fences that ran for miles, a main house built of solid timber and stone that looked like it could withstand anything the territory threw at it. Smaller buildings, bunkhouses, stables, a smithy, were scattered across the property, all well-maintained and purposeful. The small house William had mentioned sat on a rise overlooking a creek, modest but infinitely better than the cabin they'd left behind. It had real windows with glass panes, a stone chimney that promised warmth, and a front porch where Lucy immediately began planning where she'd sit in the summer. Inside, the house was simple but clean. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a working stove, and a sitting area with furniture that, while worn, was comfortable and solid. Margaret walked through slowly, her fingers trailing over the walls, the windowsills, as if afraid that touching them too firmly would make them disappear. "It's real, Ma," Caleb said softly, watching her. She turned to him, tears streaming down her face, and pulled him into a fierce embrace. "You did this," she whispered. "You saved us." "No," Caleb replied, his own voice thick. "I just helped someone who needed it. The rest," he glanced around the room, "the rest is William Thornhill's doing." "Then he's a good man," Margaret said, stepping back and wiping her eyes. "And so are you." The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work and new beginnings. Caleb threw himself into ranch life, learning quickly and earning the respect of the other hands through his dedication and honesty. He worked from sunrise to sunset, mending fences, herding cattle, breaking horses, his body aching in ways it never had before. But it was the good kind of ache, the kind that came from honest work and fair pay. Samuel, when his mind was clear, would sometimes sit on the porch of the main house and watch Caleb work. On one such afternoon, William approached Caleb as he was finishing up in the stables. "My father talks about you," William said, leaning against the stable door. "On his good days, he remembers that night. He says you reminded him what kindness looks like." Caleb set down the brush he'd been using and turned to face him. "I'm just glad he's safe." "So am I," William said quietly. Then after a pause, "You've got a future here, Caleb, not just as a ranch hand, but as someone I can trust, someone I can rely on. That's rare in this world." Caleb nodded, not quite sure what to say to that. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Caleb sat on the porch of their new home. Lucy was inside helping their mother prepare dinner, actual dinner, with meat and vegetables and fresh bread. The smell drifted out through the open window, warm and comforting. Margaret stepped outside and sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Are we okay now? Lucy had asked that question weeks ago, back in the cabin, when everything still felt uncertain. Now, watching the sun set over land that felt like possibility itself, Caleb finally knew the answer. Yeah, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. We're going to be just fine. For the first time in his life, Caleb Morgan believed in tomorrow. And not just tomorrow, he believed in all the tomorrows that would come after. Because one act of kindness, one choice to help a stranger in need, had opened a door he never knew existed. And on the other side was hope. 6 months had passed since that frozen night, when Caleb found Samuel lost in the snow, and Thornhill Ranch had become more than just a place of work. It had become home. Spring had arrived in full force, transforming the harsh winter landscape into something alive and vibrant. Wildflowers dotted the rolling hills, the creek ran clear and cold with snowmelt, and the cattle grazed peacefully across pastures that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The ranch was thriving, and so was Caleb. He'd grown into his role with a natural ease that surprised even himself. The other ranch hands, initially skeptical of the young newcomer who'd been brought in under such unusual circumstances, had come to respect him. His work ethic was undeniable, his judgment sound, and his ability to handle difficult horses had earned him a reputation that spread beyond Thornhill's borders. William had noticed too. Over the months, he'd gradually given Caleb more responsibility, overseeing the breaking of new horses, managing supply runs into town, even helping negotiate cattle sales with neighboring ranches. It was the kind of trust that couldn't be bought, only earned. On this particular morning, Caleb rode back from checking the northern fence line, his horse moving at an easy trot beneath him. The sun was high, warming his shoulders, and for a moment he allowed himself to simply appreciate the view, the vast expanse of land, the distant mountains, the sense of belonging that had slowly replaced the constant anxiety that had defined his earlier life. As he approached the main house, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on the porch. Samuel was in his rocking chair, a blanket across his lap despite the warmth, his eyes following the movement of the ranch with that peculiar mix of clarity and confusion that characterized his better days. Caleb dismounted, tying his horse to the rail, and climbed the porch steps. "Afternoon, Mr. Thornhill." Samuel looked up, and his face brightened with recognition. "Caleb," he said, his voice stronger than usual. "Sit with me a moment, won't you?" Caleb settled into the chair beside him, removing his hat and wiping the sweat from his brow. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ranch hands work in the distance, the rhythmic sound of hammering from the smithy carrying on the breeze. "Do you know what day it is?" "Yeah," Samuel asked suddenly. Caleb thought for a moment. "Thursday, I think. May 14th. Samuel nodded slowly. "It's been exactly 6 months since you found me. Since you saved my life." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what needed doing, sir." "No," Samuel said firmly, his gaze sharp and focused in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "You did more than that. You saw a stranger in need and you sacrificed what little you had to help him. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how many people walked past me that day before you stopped?" Caleb didn't have an answer to that. Samuel reached over and placed a weathered hand on Caleb's arm. "My son has been searching for a way to thank you properly. The job, the house, those were just the beginning. He wants to make you a partner in the ranch, Caleb. A real partner, with a stake in the land and the business." Caleb's breath caught. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Samuel replied with a slight smile. "You've earned it 100 times over. William sees what I see, a young man of character, someone who can be trusted with something precious. This ranch has been in our family for 2 generations, and William wants to ensure it continues to thrive long after we're gone." The weight of what Samuel was offering settled over Caleb like a mantle, heavy with responsibility, but also with honor and possibility. "I'd be proud to accept," Caleb said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Samuel squeezed his arm once, then released it, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "Good. That's settled then." That evening, Caleb sat with his mother and Lucy at the table in their house, the lamp burning softly between them. He'd told them about Samuel's offer, about what it meant for their future, and Margaret had cried, not tears of sadness this time, but of overwhelming gratitude and relief. "Do you ever think about that night?" Lucy asked, her young face serious. "About what would have happened if you just walked past him?" Caleb considered the question. He thought about the cabin they'd left behind, about the hunger and cold and uncertainty. He thought about Garrett Hawthorne and his friends, about a town that had made him feel worthless. And then he thought about this, the warmth of their home, the food on their table, the future that stretched before them, bright with promise. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think about it all the time." "Do you regret it?" Lucy pressed. "Stopping, I mean. It was dangerous. He could have been anyone." Caleb shook his head. "Not for a second. Because helping him, helping someone who couldn't help himself, that taught me something important." "What's that?" Margaret asked softly. Caleb looked at both of them, his family, safe and warm and hopeful. That kindness isn't just about what you give, it's about who you become when you choose to give it. Outside, the stars began to emerge one by one, tiny points of light piercing the deepening blue of the twilight sky. The ranch settled into its evening rhythm, horses nickering softly in their stalls, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. And somewhere in that vast, wild territory, beneath those same stars, other stories were unfolding, other choices being made, other lives hanging in the balance between indifference and compassion. But here, in this moment, Caleb Morgan knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. One act of kindness had changed everything, not just for him, not just for his family, but for everyone whose lives he would now touch in the years to come. The legacy of that frozen night would ripple outward, touching people he would never meet, inspiring acts of kindness he would never witness. Because that's what compassion does. It multiplies, spreads, transforms. And it all started with one cold night, one lost old man, and one young cowboy who chose to care.